Joining me now for more on this is former Pentagon advisor Jason Israel, also a member of the US Navy Reserve. Jason, thanks very much for your time. Why don't we start with why you think the strike was carried out? Was this something that previous US leaders could have carried out, opted not to because of the ramifications, or would this perhaps have been the first time they could have had a definitive strike on the commander?
Thank you, Tom, for having me, and as always, appreciate you mentioning my Navy Reserve affiliation. As I'm not on duty, as always, these views are my own. Good question about the question being why was the strike carried out, and how unusual is this? I think we've heard that if you sift through sort of what Trump's strategic goal might be from his language over the last year or two, one has obviously been to keep Iran from gaining a nuclear weapon, which this was not necessarily associated with, and then the second being Iran supporting terrorism around the world and supporting terrorist acts. And this was certainly Qasem Soleimani being somebody who was directly associated with that. So Trump thinking that, as previous administrations have, that Soleimani being directly involved in planning and organizing and leading those attacks, being somebody that you could remove from the battlefield and at least temporarily remove that. As far as whether or not it's unprecedented, this is a state actor. Iran is a state actor, and any of these attacks or attacks with drones, the decision-making process, as I mentioned before, President Obama actually declassified our decision-making process that we used for this. You can find it online with sort of the top-secret elements that were top secret, just plainly there, so you can actually see what the process was, and it was directly associated with an imminent attack and directly associated with al-Qaeda, which was a group that the U.S. was at war with, and it was a non-state actor. So those are the differences right now. As you saw, we sort of have a period of de-escalation where we can reevaluate what's happening. But the question will be on both sides, what is their strategic goal, and are they meeting it? That could be the question that helps you answer whether or not we could see further violence.
Right. So, Donald Trump's spoken about this imminent attack without putting any real detail on it. If we put that to one side, feel free to comment on that if you'd like to, but in terms of his actual aim here, I suppose we might be getting to the point, if we fast forward a month, where he gets this strike, he's killed the commander, and for now Iran's retaliation has stopped going beyond anything that would take actual US casualties. So does Donald Trump kind of get what he wanted?
I think the answer is yes, in the short term. If President Trump did not want there to be escalation, as most don't, to an all-out war with Iran, and if you actually read the Iranian commander's statement, and I think it was earlier today, stating we were not seeking loss of life, and they were actually seeking loss of property. And in fact, as you saw in reports, that Iraq and the U.S. had several hours of notice of what the actual target would be, also not just because Iraq was fueling its rockets, but because of the actual target was apparently disclosed ahead of time, so it allowed there to be removal of personnel. Iran knew that if there was a loss of even one U.S. service member or U.S. citizen, that would be considered an escalation, so that did allow for there to be a response without that. The question on imminence, it's going to be interpreted by both sides. One side could say, well, because they talked about it, then it was imminent. But there is, so each administration might have a slightly different legal hurdle by which they would determine whether something is imminent, and whether there would actually be a who, what, when, where, why, how would have to be answered before they would say it's imminent. It doesn't sound like that's the case. And in fact, President Trump routinely referred to Soleimani's career body of work, if you will, saying this should have been done a long time ago, which actually is in contrast to the question of whether it was done because of an imminent attack.
Yeah, he's mentioned that. He did say there was something planned without, as I said, going into detail. The complicating factor is this Ukrainian airplane, the civilian plane shot down near Tehran airport. There is some vision that's trying to be verified as to whether it's accurate or not, whether this does actually purport to be the situation of a missile being fired off and hitting that plane. You've got 180 lives more lost, innocent lives, so that's the first tragedy out of all of this. But the conversations from Scott Morrison and Justin Trudeau, they're emphasising the accidental part of that. That's important if there's going to be an avoiding of escalation.
Yes, absolutely. And if you look at what we just said, that President Trump would not want there to be further escalation because he would not want there to be movement toward an all-out war, as most don't, then they would actually hope in some way that despite this tragedy, which it is a tragedy, loss of innocent lives, that it was an accident, and that could be proven that it was an accident, so that all sides could could actually continue to stay in this sort of period of de-escalation.
How believable is it? I mean, we heard only a couple of days before about Iran and the capabilities they have. They could strike these targets without any casualties, and somehow this possibly major defence system shot a plane out of the sky that had taken off from Tehran 2 minutes ago. It sounds like a pretty staggering blunder if there was no intent.
It's definitely a staggering and tragic blunder if it was a blunder, Tom. And all we'll say is that when you're a planner and you're planning for conflict, as I have multiple times throughout my career, there is that term that you've heard, which is the fog of war. It's the unanticipated things, it's malfunctions, it's maybe a miscommunication between two people. And we study a lot of World War II and the fact that units and vessels didn't have even the type of communication we have today. Some of those issues can still happen today. So whether it was a communication breakdown between people or was just a malfunction. Also, there's a lot of drills that are often run, but you have your equipment set in different modes when you're running drills. And if you actually switch them to a real battle-ready mode, then you could have actually not even tested the modes of that equipment. So there are a lot of factors that could have caused this. And of course, we should say tragically, just over 30 years ago, as you know, an Iranian civilian airliner was shot down accidentally by a U.S. warship. So I'm sure that that's ringing in the memories of Iran and right now, but there is history there as well. And there are, as I've read, reports of many Iranians still thinking to this day that that happened intentionally, despite it being proven as an accident.
What do you make of the mindset? We've seen so many Iranians on the streets there. This is a regime that's certainly not responsible for a lot of good at the moment there. Do you think this has galvanized, or do we need to take the pictures with a grain of salt given how the regime operates?
It certainly seems that it's galvanized anti-U.S. opinion. I'm not an Iran expert particularly, but to say that this attack would give rise to a nationalist sentiment. I mean, this is some of the hardest lessons we've learned in Iraq and in Afghanistan and in wars before that, is that it actually gives a regime a common enemy to try to get its people behind, particularly as we've talked about the Iranian economy really being in shambles due to the sanctions that the U.S. and other countries have put in place. So the regime is really trying to use this to get unity behind the anti-U.S. sentiment, which it's had anyway, but particularly after recent deaths during protests, and some saying Soleimani was actually behind the killing of protesters against the Iranian regime. So anything they can do to ensure stability, they will do.
Yeah, well, in that regard, I'm sure some there very cynically are thankful for the distraction. Jason, Israel, we're going to get to some other topics, but a lot on this one today, so we'll talk more around the global hotspots next week. Thanks for your time, mate.
Thanks for having me, Tom.